Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have to go one step backward because we won't reshape the cosmos during our panel session now, but may have the object in mind. But before we start the discussion, let me shortly introduce the participants of our panel. You've already known Mr. Oschmann, who's given his speech before the break. He's the CEO of Merck. And next to my right, it's Julie Maupin, who is a senior research fellow at the Max Planck Institute in Heidelberg. To my left, it's Jörg Rocholl, who is the director of the European School of Management and Technology in Berlin. Then it's Herbert Reitsamer, who is a doctor, medical specialist for ophthalmology here in Salzburg. And last but not least is Bruce Pon, who is the co-director of the enterprise which our speaker before runs in Berlin and deals with blockchain issues. I think we had a lot of discussions during the last 2 days and had some problems in identifying what the common good or the public good or the public welfare, which might also be a reasonable translation for Gemeinwohl, is, and have learned that it is very difficult to define it. And I think if we have listened to the speaker before us, it might have been frightening for the one or the other that this development might go into a direction that the one or the other doesn't like as much, even if the picture at the end is fabulous. No doubt about this. And during the panel before, we've heard that 89% of the population think that enterprises should care more about common welfare or the common good. But my guess is that everybody of us has a different concept of what the common good is. There are some principles which we have to fulfill or reach, or we can find orientation at, but what it means in practical terms might be very dependent on how the position of the individual is. And against this background, I start with Bruce Pon, and I would ask him, our theme is what is digitalization and the common good. What do you understand under the term of digitalization, and what are the advantages, not in the far future 100 years ago, but perhaps during the next 5 or 10 years, that societies in the Western world, the German society, European societies, can take from this development of digitalization?
Digitization, there are a lot of, in Germany particularly, in the German region, there are a lot of initiatives going on about getting a handle on digitization. And one of the main problems is, how do you define digitization? The way that I see digitization is actually a series of technologies that are digital in nature. So for instance, computerization, internet, artificial intelligence, and blockchain. And these technologies work together to open up new possibilities for us to create value, to improve productivity, to allow for a reduction of transaction costs, and make it so that we as humans can be more connected to each other. And that's kind of the definition I give for blockchain, for digitization. I guess some of the disadvantages of it is that...
Let's talk about the disadvantages later.
Okay.
May I ask you, so what does people can achieve with this developments, and how will it affect our everyday life during the next 10 years, perhaps? What's your guess?
I think that the question of digitalization and the common good is the prospects, the benefits, is a very important one to think about, particularly in the context of the digital divide that we have currently still. So when we think about how do we create the common good for our entire planet, things like the interplanetary database or file system, we have to think about the fact that currently 30% of the population still doesn't have 3G coverage, and 15% doesn't even have electricity. So how are they going to be plugged in to this great machine that takes us all forward as a common society? So I think that if we think about it in the context of making sure that digitization is a way that we can connect the remaining sectors of our society, of our planet, who are still not connected to the other parts of the world, that's one of the major benefits. And the other major benefit, just simply by bringing them into the system, the other major benefit is that we still have pockets of the world where, although there are technologies, the technologies are controlled in ways that are not necessarily beneficial to human empowerment, individual empowerment. You can think about firewalls in China, you can think about use and abuse of various different media infrastructures in different countries. And having truly a shared global substrate, as Trent put it, which is decentralized and digitized in a way that gives individuals the ability to connect without regard to what their state tells them they can and can't do, or without regard to even what their neighbor says they should or shouldn't do in terms of social norms. That's a very powerful and potentially empowering thing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mr. Rocholl, will digitalization be really a tool to overcome firewalls as we find them in authoritarian regimes, and as they grow up, as far as I can observe it? Turkey has started with tools like this, Russia does it, and others too. Do you think that it will lead to a sort of democratization of information?
It certainly can. It certainly can go this way by providing more information. At the same time, there might also be negative side effects of that. What I'd like to say maybe more broadly is it is similar to what basically the Austrian economist Schumpeter has described as creative destruction. It's always a permanent new combination of production factors that is now also taking place. And this obviously means there will be new endeavors, new enterprises being created, and at the same time, some of them will just leave. And the big question now is, what is the scale of this recombination of production factors? To what extent will this happen? And maybe one point on this question of artificial intelligence, to what extent is it really driven then by human beings' decisions right away, or by which way could it actually be somehow automated by some artificial intelligence devices?
Okay. Thank you. This enables us to change the playing field. You've talked about effects on the human body that digitalization may have. Could you tell us a bit more on the aspects as far as lenses are concerned, or the steering of brains is concerned, and how do enterprises in the sector of health deal with this?
Yeah, so these are two different topics. One is it's about the human interface. And the things that Trent was talking about require a lot of progress also in material science. And you mentioned this. So all these fancy things, people sometimes believe as if this was purely about writing code, about collecting data, and purely about AI. It is very much about this. It's also about scientific progress within material science. So for these contact lenses or these spaceships or whatever that Trent showed, we need very novel, very, very specialized new materials. If you look at the devices we use currently, let's say an iPhone, so the iPhone, despite all the pure digital progress, would not have been possible without display technology, without materials for chip making, and much about AI and deep learning. If you look at it from a mathematical point of view, the mathematical concepts are not very new. They were mostly developed in the 1960s. What is new is the almost unlimited computational power that we have. So combining these things together is is mind-boggling. And some people in the room may think that trend is gaga, and maybe you are a bit. But many of the things that you mentioned might very well happen in the field of health and health research. It is. The most fascinating aspect is to use AI and others in order to define where to do research. But something I came across, I'm working with a company that comes out of the anti-terrorism area. These people work for the NSA, for the CIA, for the FBI. I don't know for whom, and they analyze satellite images, email traffic, whatever, for patterns. One can use basically the same logic to look into cancer research. So they would say you can find bad guys and bad cells with the same logic. So this is, from a technology point of view, it's truly transformational. But I think I'll stop here.
May I ask the doctor, will the use of digitalization not only be a self-actualization of the individual, but also self-optimization of the individual health and person and prospects in life?
Well, first of all, we have a diagnostic tool with us, most of us, all the time. It's our cell phone. And we are monitored constantly. So by giving Google your location data, they know to which doctor you go, when you go, how often you go, how many steps you make per day. So they have a pretty good profile of your health condition. And we all don't know that even, but it's well known. Every single one of us has a health profile on his cell phone. And this is very important for public health. It helps us, it's for the common good, public health, it helps us to estimate which measures we need to take to improve public health, to improve individual health. It might give you a warning, one day and say, well, with your statistics, you're running straight at heart attack. And this is not future, this is present.
Thank you. Let's come to the risks and dangers. As I work in a building which has been reshaped during the last years, and we got a smart building where the sun protection closes if the light goes on a certain angle on the windows, where lights are switched off if I don't move for a certain period. And I work in a digitalized office. I sometimes feel a little bit patronized. And I think where is my self-determination left? And as I had heard the speech before, I also thought, what with those people who want to go in a different direction, who don't share these aims? What about democracy if we say we want to deny a certain path? And we've discussed yesterday and today that some forecasts say that 85% of the people will lose their jobs according to digitalization. Udo Di Fabio has told us this is bullshit because nobody can make this prognosis. But given the number which is in the world, there might be a certain risk that this would happen. And so maybe I start with you. What are the risks and the dangers of digitalization dealing with the labor market, the future of jobs and other things?
Yeah, so the recent development, and this means the development over the last hundreds of years, has always been characterized by what is known as Polanyi's paradox. And this means we know more than we can tell, or we could also say we know more than we do know. So this means we have knowledge that goes beyond our capacity of describing what our knowledge is. And this also means if in previous times automation steps were taken, it didn't lead to more unemployment. Rather, it led to a higher value for other activities. And thus, basically, the number of jobs has increased tremendously over recent decades. So the big question that is now coming up is, if there's artificial intelligence that somehow can start learning about what human beings actually know but they can't express, whether this actually could lead to more unemployment than before. But I completely agree with Mr. Di Fabio. It's completely, unrealistic, and I would say it's also completely wild guessing to say what it means in terms of the percentage of the population that could become unemployed. I would also argue, with respect to the presentation, I'm completely against a universal basic income because it would take away incentives. It would take away probably self-privilege, self-pride of those who are affected. I'd rather like to think of an optimistic view in this by thinking about what can we do to prepare ourselves best for what is going to happen. So, for example, one aspect we discussed over the last day was to think about coding as another cultural technique that we should try to learn, say, apart from writing, reading, calculating, coming up with this, and really taking a positive view on this, not ignoring, of course, the risks, but also thinking about what are the chances that we can take.
Mr. Pon, what is the worth of self-determination and the human dignity and the ability to say no in the concept of a digitalized world?
I think that the technology in our hands right now gives immense power to all of us. And the question is, I mean, somebody asked me earlier today, what percentage of your iPhone do you use? And I would gather that for most of us, same with Microsoft Office, by the way, it's about 3% or less. And so we have these massive technologies that each one of us could become self-actualized geniuses working on a specific project that brings us a lot of fulfillment. And so I do believe that no matter what the technologies are available, we as humans do not use our full capacity. How many times do we scroll on social media or just waste time by watching TV or doing something that is not productive? And so I do believe that there are ways that people can say no, but that's actually not the problem. It's the fact of what's our higher aspiration, because the technology is all there. And if we can find a way to allow people to tap into that and figure what that is, it's not about saying no, it's about saying yes.
Are there disadvantages from your point of view?
To digitization?
To digitalization, yeah.
Well, I mean, you always have the typical story of the frustrated 21-year-old male in the computer in his parents' basement who has these massive tools at his disposal and then decides to wreak havoc on the world. I mean, this is the threat vectors are asymmetric and massive if they can find a systemic risk in a computer system.
Okay. Julie Maupin, as a lawyer, as a constitutional lawyer, I am used to look at data issues from the point of view of data protection. This is what our court has decided for 40 years. This is what the European Court of Justice decides according to our model. And I wonder, where is data protection and left in this concept? Or is there any risk to data protection?
So you're giving me the easy question.
Okay.
Yeah, data protection is an extremely important question, and it's a double-edged sword in this context, because the same technologies that on the one hand are making our data more accessible than ever to more actors than ever, are also giving us the ability to encrypt that data better and to send it in private distributed bundles that actually are much more difficult to intercept. And I say it's a double-edged sword because on the one hand, you can use these new cryptographic methods like zero-knowledge proofs and other things that are being deployed in the blockchain space and artificial intelligence. You can use them to help democracy agitators protest in China or organize. Or you can use them for the NSA to send messages back and forth. Or you can use them to protect genomic records that you then use for the health industry to be able to allow doctors to connect to pharmacies, to connect to labs, to connect to all sorts of other things in ways that are secure and not hackable. Or even potentially to require by law, perhaps, that Google, when it's tracking our location, actually can't do that because the transmitters are then encrypted before the data gets transmitted in some way. So it is a double-edged sword, and it's one that we have to think extremely carefully about, because it also has consequences for the financial system. The earliest entree of regulators into this space was the worry that these new technologies would be used to finance terrorism, which hasn't really happened very much yet, but it's a possibility. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Herbert, Reitsamer, yesterday we talked about the negative effects digitalization has on the capacity of our children to see and their eye sanity. Are there other health risks to this development?
Well, certainly we don't know yet. We haven't explored that to the full extent. Like we only use 3% of our cell phone, we don't use much more of our brains either. And but there is one really important development that might be a problem in the future, which is the constant use of this technology by children, by growing people. And they use these cell phones all the time, and they watch it very closely, so they have near accommodation in their eyes, and they get short-sighted. Myopia is a big problem. It's not only the cell phone, it's also because people don't leave the house anymore. And if they leave it, and if they go out of school, they still use it to communicate with their neighbor. And we have a situation where in South Korea and Seoul, the 19-year-old males are short-sighted. They have myopia in 96.5%. There is almost nobody left who has normal vision. And these people, at the age of 20 years, in 10% of the cases have already changes in the eye, which means that vision gets lost. And they have a good chance that along their life, still within the time when they still can work, between 35, 45, 50 years, that they will lose vision and that they will functionally get blind. And we will lose these people in our society. And I think this is a big problem. And even in Africa, they have the strongest growth. They don't have clean water, but they have cell phones. And even in these societies, the short-sighted people percentage is growing rapidly and massively. Half of the population on Earth in 2050 will have myopia, and that's a big problem.
Thank you. Stefan, Oschmann, are there disadvantages to digitalization from your point of view?
Sure, there are plenty, and it would be naive to assume that all of these technology developments are just going to create a wonderful, bright world. However, it's very difficult, extremely difficult to predict that. I personally tend to be positive. I've read a text from a 17th century German author who was predicting that the world would sort of stop existing through the occurrence of mass production of books, because people in the past would, at night, they would sit together and they would sing and they would tell stories. And now this terrible thing is happening, that people would sit there and would look into this book, and that this means absolute cultural decline. We've heard projections about urbanization with regard to that London would stop to exist because of the huge piles of horse manure that would clog all the streets. We had people after the invention of the steam engine were predicting that all jobs would be lost when the steam engine was invented. 95% of Britons worked in agriculture, and so on. So I have no idea. That's what I'm trying to. That's what I'm trying to say. And I don't want to pontificate. I hear some CEOs, politicians pontificate about this topic as if they absolutely knew that 90% of jobs would be gone, and as if we could predict the world. I find that naive.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One last question to the panel before we open for 2 questions to the audience. What about regulation? How intensively does the state or the European Union or the OECD have to accompany this development, Mr. Pong?
I mean, the simple answer is, how fast is technology developing? What's the cycle time for each generation of a technology? And what's the cycle time to write a law? And you could say it's 1 to 20 is the ratio. So in other words, if you want to regulate something in today's pace that is accelerating exponentially, good luck. It's not going to happen. But there is a way that you can regulate this, and it's regulate towards innovation. So there are governments where we see that realize that this innovation is not going to slow down. It's going to increase. And they see that it's a competitive advantage for their entire society, for the common good, if they make the regulations friendly. You can look at this from the perspective, any of you have tried to invest in America, the SEC, as a brake on innovation because they stop many people from having agency in investing in companies. You could talk about that with the FDA and all these things. Germany has certain examples. And then you think about societies like Singapore or Switzerland, where they promote innovation. They have sandboxes where people can experiment and then scale that up, and then they are kind of seen as the places where people want to try out these technologies.
So not too much regulation, as our dinner talk said yesterday. Is this your opinion too?
I work in one of the most regulated industries that exist, and regulation is sometimes creates a cozy environment for players that already establish it. It builds up entry barriers. So sometimes there are industries who actually love regulation. I think in the field of health, regulation is necessary, but regulation has a lot of side effects too. The US FDA for 20 years has not allowed novel drug combinations to be tested in cancer research. That has cost millions of people their lives. So my theory is that technology and science evolves much faster than regulation can. Regulation will try to catch up, and there will be certain successes, but we should not be so naive to assume as if we could set up a regulatory, sort of a self-governing regulatory framework. Still, the topics that we discussed today about the common good, I think that a societal discourse about common good and about the purpose of organizations, be it companies, research institutions, is good. To give one example, when recombinant technology, what we call gene technology or biotechnology today, when that started to become real, there were 2 scientific meetings where the top scientists in the world got together, and they defined among themselves, they said, we're not going to use this to do real nonsense. We're not going to clone human beings. And they defined a couple of other conditions, and so far that has held tight. So, it's regulation, yes, but we shouldn't assume that this will have an ultimate success rate.
Yeah, okay. As we lawyers say, es kommt drauf an. What is your answer?
Yeah, I think that in the field of regulation and lawmaking, you have to walk a fine balance, not only with technology, but with everything. You're always trading off different things when you're regulating or making laws. You're making certain groups of people happy to the detriment of others. And this is, in some senses, the representation of the Gemeinwohl, the societal good, which we have represented in our constitutions and founding principles of our society. If you look at all of the best, sort of most aspirational, successful constitutions in the world, they have founding principles. And I guess my position is that in answering this question, how much should you regulate, how soon should you regulate, I would say, cherish your principles, not your jurisdictional competences. Okay. Which is to say, focus on what is it actually that we're trying to do. What do our founding principles tell us we should be protecting as a society? Not what can I, as a regulator, potentially do, because that gives you a very myopic, narrow vision, and then you tend to put yourself in wherever you can, just because you can, and that's counterproductive, I think.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rocholl.
Yeah, I think one important aspect is to first, to not think about regulation right away, but rather to see, and this came out of our discussion, to see which ideas are really successful. So we saw in the presentation, there were a couple of companies that got, I think, a couple of millions of funding one day and were worth a couple of billions a couple of days later. But obviously, there are thousands of companies that got a couple of millions today and are worth nothing the day after, right? So this is very important. This is a very important aspect of it, otherwise it wouldn't work. And so, therefore, let's first just focus our attention on those that really do work. And then maybe to take one concrete example, let's think about autonomous driving. This actually, I think, provides a good part, first on the question of innovation. So I think here we can be far away from pessimism. For example, there are some studies showing that about 60% of patents for autonomous driving are currently held by German companies. So there's no reason to say, oh, we are completely overtaken by competitors elsewhere. So therefore, we should rather foster the innovation. And at the same time, there are questions which, for example, could be described as a classical Greek tragedy. If a car is supposed to hit or is supposed to have an accident, it's not avoidable to have the accident, whom should the car hit? So is it a person, which person? And these are obviously very important questions to consider.
This may even be difficult for human beings. So, Mr. Reitsamer.
I think I completely agree. Technological life cycle is way too short to react. And I think that's the reason why we need to start an ethical thinking process of what we want to have in the future, what's our desire to have and what we don't want to have, so that we can react faster. And the second point, if Mars really one day would be accessible and I go there, I would have a regulation that all the Trumps and Erdogans must stay on Earth. So
okay.
If that's possible.
This is good final remark. So we have the possibility for 2 short questions. Please, this gentleman here and the gentleman in the last row.
Yes, this is Franz von
Stand up and please tell us who you are.
My name is Franz von Weizsäcker. My question is about the goals for societal good. I mean, there's one rough consensus about the Sustainable Development Goals, which is for the next 15 years. But if you think beyond these 15 years, given the rapid technological developments, what would be your goal setting? I would like to ask the panel, looking beyond, should we prevent to have robot overlords rule the world, or what would be your vision beyond 2030?
Thank you. Maybe we take also the second question and answer them together.
My name is Vincent Boop. My question is directed to Professor Reitsamer, because he said the statistic. My question is if the statistics of South Korea, especially because of the ice, are representative for the world, because in South Korea, esports is part of the culture at least, and that's not the case, for example, in Germany or in the US. So is that really representative?
Mr. Reitsamer.
So this is a worldwide development that we are facing, and the young people in Middle Europe currently are at 25% myopia, and in 2050 we will have the average myopia of 56%, but the young people will then be at 90% already. And this is something we can't stop anymore because it has already taken place. These young people will in 2050 will just, this hump in development will arrive in 2050 and we only can face it. So it's even in Africa, we're currently in Central Africa, we're at 7% myopia, and those have the fastest growing rate of all regions.
And who is willing to answer the first question, the objectives of this development?
Prior to the SDGs, we had the Millennium Development Goals. And prior to that, there were other UN goals. And if we look at historically what has happened versus these goals, the Millennium Development Goals were rather specific and technical, and we achieved quite a lot, especially in the area of health. And it does make sense to steer development and steer technology toward reducing poverty, increasing health, and monitoring this. There are people like Bill Gates and his wife who introduced a business-like approach with metrics, with monitoring, to doing the right thing. And they also have brought in private players together with government in this field. So I think that this part of the Sustainable Development Goals makes a lot of sense. I personally feel that the SDGs are too broad and are too lofty. If we were to achieve this over 15 years, I would definitely want to make a bet that this is not going to happen. Goals beyond 15 years, I don't know. Maybe you are all very much smarter than I am. I would not have predicted Donald Trump as the President of the United States 3 years ago. I would not have predicted Syria. There's so many things that the world is, there's so many things that are developing in the world. And if central planning and long-term goal setting would really work, the Soviet Union would still exist. I would assume so. I feel I have the liberty to abstain from goals beyond 15 years.
This is a very good final remark, ladies and gentlemen.